be all doom and gloom, but events in the Middle East, as well as the ongoing war in Ukraine, will only exacerbate the cost of living crisis already hurting so many households here in Australia. It costs a small fortune to fill your grocery trolley, and we haven't even talked about filling your fuel tank. Inflation is still high, unemployment is rising, and the prospect of more rate rises is still very real. Joining me now is Leith Van Onselen, an economist who's worked for the Australian and Victorian Treasury and is co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. Leith, the Australian Retail Association reported that Australians will spend $24 billion on Boxing Day sales. That's a 1.6% increase on last year. But then again, prices are higher and we've got a lot more people in the country. So what does that result tell us about where the economy is at?
Well, James, it actually tells us that Australians are actually doing it pretty tough at the moment. Now, that 1.6% increase in Boxing Day sales comes against population increase of about 2.4%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And we've also obviously had inflation of around 5%. So once you strip those two things out of the equation, it basically means that real retail sales would have fallen by about 6% over that period. And that effectively tells you that households have cut back on their expenditure. Individual households have, and it's only been offset by effectively inflation and obviously the huge growth in the population.
So with that result, I mean, last year there were fears that we'd enter into a recession. That didn't eventuate. To what extent did high migration numbers prevent a recession last year? And can migrants save us again in 2024? Indeed, is that even desirable policy?
Yeah, well, absolutely. The only thing that saved Australia from a recession was obviously its turbocharged record immigration that we had last year. Now, the most recent data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics said that we received 518,000 net overseas migrants in the 2022-2023 financial year. And what that did was that actually increased the population by 2.4%. Now, if you strip those numbers out, you strip the growing population out, Australia's GDP in per capita terms actually fell for three consecutive quarters last year, all the way through to September, which is the most recent data. And what that tells you is that effectively the overall economy has been growing, the economic pie has been growing, but everyone's slice of the pie has actually shrunk. And that's not desirable, obviously. And I think we're probably going to get a similar situation this year. Immigration should fall a bit. The federal government's projected 375,000 net overseas migrants, which is obviously a decent reduction, but that still would be the second highest in Australia's history. And I think we're going to have another year whereby the economy grows, but everyone's slice of the pie continues to shrink because it doesn't grow fast enough to soak up the extra people.
Just help me understand, in terms of migration, I mean, obviously it helps the economy, but is that a desirable way for the government to keep the economy out of recession, or does that just mask underlying problems which will hit us later down the track?
Oh, absolutely, it masks underlying problems. Look, if I had my way, I would not allow the economy to be reported as the key metric of GDP growth, which is basically the overall economy. I'd basically make the statistical agencies report everything in per capita terms, because that's what matters. For individual households, for individual Australians, it's basically how their individual circumstances are changing that matters. It doesn't matter what the overall economy is doing. If we're simply just adding people to the economy to make it grow and to make the overall pie larger while everyone's share of the pie shrinks and living standards falls, I think that's self-defeating policy. And that's effectively been Australia's economic policy over the last 15 years or nearly the last 20 years. It's basically been to fire hose in as many people as we can, make the economy grow, avoid recessions, while individual living standards basically haven't improved or in many cases have gone backwards.
Yeah, I think many people would agree with you on that. Looking internationally, things are pretty gloomy. Overnight, we had the US Navy destroy 3 boats carrying Houthi militants after they attacked a container ship in the Red Sea. Those attacks are now putting real pressure on the global shipping industry. It's a long way away from Australia, but do you see a situation where that starts to have an effect on the cost of goods here in Australia?
Look, James, I sincerely hope not. One of the good news stories that had arisen over the past few months was that we've actually had global goods deflation. So what that means is anything that arrives into countries by boat, so all your imported goods, that type of thing, has been falling in price. And that's basically was a reversal of what happened over the pandemic, where we had obviously supply bottlenecks everywhere, and that drove up prices viciously. Because economies have been slowing at the same time as we had all the supply come back online, we're actually getting downward pressure on inflation. Now, the risk of these attacks is that obviously that process reverses and we start getting these supply shortages and bottlenecks again because we basically can't get goods from country A to country B. If that escalates and becomes, a much more pervasive problem, that'll be a problem not just for the globe, but will also filter down to Australia, given that pretty much all our goods that we get into this country are imported. And that could see interest rates remain high for longer, which is not what we want.
All right, we certainly don't want that. Give us some good news. What's your best case economic scenario for Australia in 2024? Encourage us a little bit, Leith. We need it.
Yeah, well, I mean, look. The best case scenario is that these attacks in the Middle East don't disrupt global supply chains, and we actually have falling inflation globally, brought down by goods, primarily. And what that would mean is that the central banks are likely done raising interest rates, including in Australia, and we could actually start seeing interest rate cuts towards the second half of this year. That's the best case scenario, and it would mean that basically this 18 months of pain that Australian households have suffered would start to alleviate, and we could also potentially see lower migration than what the federal government's forecast. That's more hopium and wishful thinking, but if we get that, that would also ease the rental crisis. So those are the two things I'm hoping happen this year.
Well, that would be a very happy new year. Leith Van Onselen, thanks so much for your time.
No worries, James. Anytime. Thanks.